Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a white horse in graphite. Now the techniques that I'm going to share here can also be applied when drawing any lighter coloured horse, so if you do have a grey horse maybe on the easel, then this would also be okay using the techniques and the layering process that I'm going to show. Now the first thing that I like to do as always is start off with the eye. So here I'm just building up my layers gradually, just getting that contrast right, keeping the white of the paper visible for my brightest highlights and then darkening them up later if I need to. But you can see here I've gone really dark with these layers, but I haven't jumped into my darkest pencil first. I've made sure to build up all of those layers underneath so that I'm still really enhancing all of that depth that can be created. So working on the hair around the eye and for the rest of the face, I want to start off with my graphite powder first. Now all of my graphite tutorials that I have here on YouTube, I demonstrate how I use graphite powder in every single project. It's something for me that I like to incorporate to get that base foundation in first. Now what I'm starting to do here when I work with my pencils is reinforcing my lights and my darks. Now when I look at that reference photo, I want to study closely any subtle variations between the highlights and shadows. Now as you can see here, I'm starting to really focus on those darker mid-tones, but again, just like when I worked with the eye, I'm not jumping in with my darkest pencil first. The layering process and how we build up those values is really important. Now one of my biggest tips when drawing white fur, white hair, no matter what the animal is, its white is never truly white. We want to be making sure that we've captured any subtle grey tones in the case of working with graphite, because that's going to help to build up more of that shape of the face. So you can see here that all of those changes in the lights and the darks, the very subtle midtones, this is helping to build up more of that three-dimensional look that we're going for when aiming for photorealistic portraits. Now once I was happy with my base foundation, that's when I can start to work on my details. So I like to focus on three main things. We've got the fur length, fur thickness and fur direction. Now of course that also goes for hair, for feathers, whatever it is that we're drawing. Now the direction of the hair on the face is going to vary depending on the structure of that animal. Now with horses, they have the bony structures under the skin. You can sometimes see the veins under the skin as well. So that's going to create little bumps on top of that skin, which are going to be determined and captured correctly through the use of fur or hair direction. Now I want to be making sure that I'm really studying that as closely as I can in my reference photo, because if the direction of the pencil strokes don't match the structure of the face, then what happens as we continue to build up those details, we do end up changing the shape of the face. Now if we're working with creating pet portraits, obviously that is a real issue because it won't resemble as much of that pet as it should. So the fur direction isn't random. It does follow those structures under the skin. Now the length of the pencil strokes is very important as well. If we get those too long, we're going to make the horse look fluffier than it should be. If they're too short, then we're not going to really hint at enough detail. So the way that we capture that is just by determining how long that pencil or eraser should be in contact with the paper for. And of course that really is going to vary depending on the animal that we're drawing. Now the thickness of the pencil strokes is going to be determined by a couple of different factors. Here we need to work with how much pressure to apply to the pencil, how sharp the lead is, how we're moving the pencil, and even how we're holding the pencil. Those four things are going to make a real difference for the thickness of those pencil or eraser details. Now I want to be making sure that I'm varying all three of these things to make sure that the texture in that one area that I'm working on is correct. If it's not, then as I said, just like with the fur direction, it's going to really change what that animal looks like. Now all of these techniques, they need to be brought together and worked properly in a way that captures that photograph. So what I like to do for my Patreon tutorials is add the voiceover while I'm drawing, so I'm able to explain everything in the moment and really pinpoint what specific techniques I'm using at that time and why. Now because we're using specific techniques, it's important to know what techniques are not going to work in that situation and what to do if you end up making a mistake. Now mistakes, I welcome those because they actually improve our drawing skills. The way that we learn is by learning from the mistakes we've created. Which is why if I do something that I'm not quite happy with, I'll always show in the Patreon tutorials how to fix it and what techniques would work best instead. Now one thing that I find helps to reduce the chance of making mistakes is if I work in smaller sections. Now of course this is something that's going to be very subjective to each artist and there really is no right or wrong. But I've personally find that if I work in small sections, I don't get overwhelmed. Now, feeling overwhelmed and stressed by whatever it is that we're drawing can make us doubt that process and therefore make mistakes that we may not necessarily make if we work on those smaller sections. So as you can see here, I'm mapping in that nostril and then I'm just focusing on that one section. When I've got that about 80-90% complete, I can then work on something else next to it. Now what this means is I slowly start to piece the puzzle together, and then this drawing starts to resemble that reference photo far quicker than it would if I personally worked in whole individual layers. Now as I say, that's just my preference. If working in whole layers works for you, then that is absolutely fine. But if you do feel like you're looking at your reference photo, you're sitting there and you're hesitating, not quite sure where you should be working, that is a sign that you're maybe potentially working on too much of a larger area. Maybe scale that down to 1 or 2 inches and see how that works. And this area here would actually be a prime example of that. The section that I'm working on, it's very small little pigmented spots on the nose. Now if I was to start to work on this for whole one individual layers, I know for a fact that I'm probably going to end up blocking it in too much. I won't end up with this speckled or mottled appearance that I'm trying to build up here. So just by focusing on that one area, really noticing those little markings that make this horse unique, it's not allowed myself to become stressed by that. And there's quite a few little details there that could have been more time consuming. But because I focused on one area at a time, I was able to work through that more productively. Now, one of my biggest tips when drawing horse noses or horse mouths is to make sure that we're focusing on shading around the key areas that curve. So for example here, where I'm working on the nostril, you can see that I'm already building up where those grey values curve over the lightest part of the highlight on that nostril that I haven't drawn yet. So by replicating that now at this stage, I'm already building up more of that three-dimensional rounded shape. As I now come in with my pencils, you can see that I'm softening that curve even more, and look at how it's now curving back over to that highlight on the left-hand side. That's really helped to build up shape and form to that one area. Noticing the shading to where things curve over can make a real difference to how realistic that portrait looks. Now another big tip when working on this section is the hair is very short compared to the rest of the face and even the body. So I want to be making sure that I'm adjusting the length of my pencil strokes here to replicate the right textures. Now of course this is going to vary depending on the time of year. Some horses in the winter are going to develop a much thicker coat. One of my horses ends up with fur around the muzzle area that's quite a bit more fluffy looking. So I do have to be making sure that no matter what horse I'm drawing, I'm studying the length of that fur or coat hair type really closely. Now in some cases here you don't actually have to draw individual pencil strokes, you might just have to do some shading. So an example would be maybe on a tiger portrait just above the nose, the hair there is exceptionally short, so you won't necessarily need to have any length to your pencil strokes at all. Just having small circles, little shading techniques is enough to build and replicate that texture. Now one of the things that I'm asked more frequently is how to improve on the level of realism that we're capturing at that time. Now one of my biggest tips would not only be everything I've covered here, such as contrast and layers, but it's the amount of time that section should be given. Now if I'm wanting to create this level of detail, I can't possibly achieve that in 1 or 2 hours. You know, I've got to make sure that I'm willing to spend days on this if needed. Now I want to be making sure that if I don't feel like I've captured the right amount of realism, that maybe I double the amount of time that I spend on it. So if maybe you've worked on something for 5 hours, add 10 to 15 hours to it. You want to be making sure that that layering process is given the right amount of time. If I add 10 to 15 layers here, each one of those layers, it can't be done in a couple of minutes. So therefore each layer might necessarily take an hour. So it's just about making sure that that portrait is given the right amount of time, because often if we're only doing something for an hour or 2 hours, we're skipping through very important stages that will show when that portrait's finished. And that's also why I don't speed up any of my Patreon tutorials and they are all in real time, because having sections that are cut out or sped up gives the impression that that drawing has taken half the amount of time that it actually has. And it's important to me to make sure that I am being very realistic with how long each of these techniques and the processes take. Now when I start working on the bridle or a head collar, I will always focus on the abstract shapes and I will draw one strap at a time. This ensures there that I don't end up getting lost with any section of that bridle, which can happen very quickly. Now when drawing metal, it's very important to make sure that we get good contrast. So if anything is wet or shiny, you've got to make sure that you've got your shadows nice and dark and your highlights really bright. This is immediately going to give that impression that it's reflecting that light. So I want to be making sure that if I've got a really bright highlight on any section of metal, that I allow the white of the paper to show through. I can darken it up later if I need to, but having the white of the paper there is going to mean that I've got that highlight as bright as I can possibly get it. I can then add my shadows, really refine that contrast, and you start to then build up that metallic, that metal look. Now when I work on fabric or leather, I really want to focus on my base layer. This is just the same when working with my hair or any section of the actual animal itself. The only difference being I've used my pencils for my base layer rather than graphite powder. The only reason is these straps are narrow. I wouldn't necessarily have enough space to add my graphite powder without going over the sections of the horse. So here I'm just using my pencils, but the concept is exactly the same. I wanted to get a base foundation in first and then I start adding in my details, and it helps just to simplify that process. And this head collar, it didn't really have much detail. It was a fabric head collar, so it didn't have that reflected, shinier surface that leather does. So I just wanted to hint at little bits of texture within that fabric. Now the very last stage here is the body, and this came together very quickly because it's out of focus. So I used my eye makeup applicators and I'm applying my graphite powder, and it immediately gives me that soft, blurry effect right from the beginning. You can of course use your pencils for this, but it will take longer and you're more likely to run into more issues with harsher strokes. So I do like to make sure that I'm using my graphite powder here as much as I can. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up, because it makes a huge difference to my channel. If you are interested in drawing along to the real-time tutorial of this, then it is available now on my Patreon. I'll link all of that in the description below if it's of interest. If you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below, because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I do upload 2 videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week.